I have the honor and privilege of turning it over to my dear friends, Dr. Mina Attia and Dr. Bagmi. One of them graduated from what I thought was one of the best education schools in America. The other one is a very fine chap himself. They are going to be talking about LGBTQ asylum seekers and a little bit of information, as well as a paper they presented. I'll turn it over to them, but we'll definitely place the citation and the link to the paper in the chat as we go on. And as always, feel free to engage in the chat and drop your questions. They will leave some time at the end for Q&A. Dr. Attia, Dr. Dash, please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Wright. And thank you everybody that's here attending with us today. We're going to be talking about the experiences of LGBTQ plus asylum seekers specifically in the United States. We're going to look at pre and post-migration experiences, and we'll also talk about post-migration growth and resilience. We'll get into our rationale of going into the post-migration growth based on just our line of research here. As we're getting started, I do want to just acknowledge that we are very aware of the events that are currently going on in the Middle East and how heartbreaking, the things that we're seeing are, both in Palestine and Israel. And I want to share that the Department of Counseling and Human Development takes the issue of anti-racism and anti-oppression very seriously. And we have an anti-oppressive statement located on our department website, and we want to create a safe space for all of our students and of course our colleagues. So we do want to recognize this as well as just say that our presentation may bring up some emotions for folks, especially during our current times. So I just wanted you to be prepared for that. Dr. Das, if you want to add anything else here too.
Just highlighting that we know that our student population, although we couldn't really fit them into the panel today, we acknowledge that there are a lot of refugee asylum seekers here. And even if you didn't have that status, we recognize that a lot of people have connections to several places that are suffering right now: Palestine, Israel, the Ukraine. Just to name a few. There are plenty more, but please, we wanted to share people's stories in the research that we did, and we kind of want to highlight those voices are valued. You always have a place in the Counseling and Human Development Department. All of our faculty are there and available to kind of talk through some of what we're experiencing. Thank you, Dr. Attia.
Of course. All right, so just as we're getting started here, for those of you who are not familiar with Dr. Das and myself, we are both assistant professors and core faculty members in the Department of Counseling and Human Development, and we are also the directors of the Clinical Mental Health Counseling program here. All right, let's get to it. So let's begin by defining some of our terms today. So we're going to be talking about asylum seekers, but in order for us to do that, we have to differentiate between refugees, asylees, and asylum seekers. So an asylum seeker is a person that essentially has the same definition as far as the United States Immigration Services and DHS. So that is a person that has asylum seeker is a form of protection available to people who meet the definition of refugee, who are already in the United States and are seeking admission at a port of entry. So there are folks that are coming in and seeking to gain asylum here, and they don't have the status of refugee yet, which is a bit different than refugees who are coming into the United States with that status. An asylee is a little bit different too, because an asylee is a person who is no longer seeking asylum but has been granted asylum. And a refugee, which is sort of the bigger umbrella here that asylees and asylum seekers would fall under, are people who have been persecuted or fear that they will be persecuted on several accounts. So that could be race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group. So in our case, being a member of the LGBTQ community, as well as political opinion. Next slide, please. A little bit of background on our research here. In some countries, same-sex activity is punishable by death. Same-sex relationships are criminalized, and transgender individuals may be brutally murdered. The United States recognizes that LGBTQ identity as well as HIV status are grounds for asylum. And so this is one of the reasons why folks could leave their countries and come here and apply for asylum status. In order to go through this process, asylum seekers have to prove that they have suffered past persecution or have a well-founded fear of persecution. And this process can be very re-traumatizing for folks. As you can imagine, folks who have gone through experiences where they were being discriminated against and then having to come here and have to open up that can of worms again can be re-traumatizing. LGBTQ plus asylum seekers have been persecuted or demonstrate a well-founded fear of persecution based on their gender identity or sexual orientation, and they have to put their identity on display in order to convince decision makers that they are indeed LGBTQ plus and that they were persecuted in their home country. This process alone can also be re-traumatizing, given that many times this is a part of their identity that they have concealed for many years in order to just survive. It's a survival mechanism. And so for many folks, this is the first time that they're having to put this on display and in a way that's very legal, and can feel a bit harsh at times. So LGBTQ asylum seekers come to the United States to have improvement in their lives and their mental health. We know that individuals of this population are typically detained 2 times as longer as their counterparts. And unfortunately, they are also 97 times more likely to experience sexual victimization during detainment. So we know with sexual victimization, it typically happens to those who are vulnerable. And this is one of those populations. And it's unfortunate, but they are experiencing sexual victimization at a dramatically higher rate than their counterparts. Next slide, please. So our rationale for doing this research, so this was conducted a couple of years ago at this point. It was in the middle of the pandemic. And when Dr. Das and I were going through the literature, we were finding that there's really not that much out there looking specifically at the post-traumatic growth experiences and resilience of this population. There is some literature that's talking about the trauma and the pre-migration experiences of trauma, but not much about what is happening on the other side. And we learned through so we're going to talk about 2 studies. We learned in the first study that with the pre-migration and post-migration trauma, there's also a lot of growth and resilience, post-traumatic growth and resilience that's happening. People are surviving. People are coming on the other end doing fine. So we're really interested in looking at that as well. There's also not that much looking at the adjustment of this population. It's not documented well in the counseling literature, which is our field. And despite there being a lot of post-migration trauma, the literature has strictly focused on early life experiences of trauma before folks immigrate. And many of the studies that were published before ours we're not looking qualitatively at these experiences. So as counselors, we're interested in hearing people's stories. So we utilize qualitative methods to do this. We heard people's narratives. We tried to make sense of those with them. And we tried to elevate their voices by doing this research. So we went this route because there was a gap. Next slide, please. All right, Dr. Das, I'll give this to you. You are currently muted, though.
Of course I am. Of course I am. Sorry, I'm toggling between 2 different screens to make sure that the thing is moving forward, but also looking at the chat. So as Dr. Attia discussed, we did 2 separate studies, and I'm going to also say I am sick. So if I'm coughing and something, I might mute myself. but hopefully I don't freak anybody out. But we do 2 separate studies. One, Dr. Wright has linked to in the chat. The second one is being published in the Counseling Psychologist, and we'll make sure that we include information as to that as well. So the first one, we really wanted to understand what are the experiences of trauma and adjustment for the LGBTQ asylum seeking population in the DC area. But the second study that built off of this, we wanted to focus more on that post-traumatic growth and resilience piece. So not necessarily just looking at the trauma and understanding the trauma piece, but how did they heal? How did they show resilience from there? So as we talk through these 2 studies, which I'll talk about the methodology in a bit, we're going to toggle between the 2 findings so that you all are kind of conceiving of how they build upon one another. But for each study, we used a similar method. So both of these were phenomenological investigations, which really provides an in-depth understanding into the lived experiences. And we try to understand that there's an assumption of an essence of their shared experience. So that's what we're looking at when we get down to themes. We use purposive sampling. Dr. Attia did an amazing job partnering with a local community agency from which we had participants for both of our studies. And I'll discuss a little about the participants in the next slide. Just for background, for inclusion, we did want to make sure that they were at least 18 years of age when they talk about trauma. Wanted to make sure there wasn't anything that we needed to take care of because they were minors. That's why we had an 18 years of age requirement. We wanted them to self-identify as a member of the LGBTQ plus community. We were not out there to say, hey, you come join our study and out yourself, right? We wanted to make sure that they felt comfortable and were open to self-identifying so that they could be in the study. And then finally, we wanted them to be either currently seeking or have been granted asylum in the United States. So the participants, we had 8 participants per study. They were the same participants. They all identified as homosexual. And 3 of them identified as male, 4 identified as female, 1 identified as non-binary. We had several countries, home countries represented. So several home cultures represented in our study. But I also want to acknowledge that a lot of these, so we had, they are varied, right? We didn't have a large concentration from one particular country and not from others. Racially, 1 identified as Asian, 1 identified as Hispanic, and then 2 identified as Black or Caucasian, and the length of time at the first study marker. So I want to distinguish, we did the first study, and then we did the second study about a year later. So at the first study, they ranged between being here 2.5 months to a full 13 years by the time they joined in our study. So so as we talk about these, I just want to remind everybody again, we're going to toggle between the study findings from the first study and the second study. So hopefully, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll try to make sure that we address them by the end. Dr. Attia, I'll hand it off to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Das. And I do just want to add that we went into the process of recruitment very delicately, again, because this is a vulnerable population. And in order for us to do research ethically and properly, we wanted to have a connection with these folks. We didn't want to just be like, hey, we're professors, we're here to hear about your stories, because that feels a little bit exploitative. So it was really important for us to have partnership with the communities to see where these people are meeting, are gathering. And through that connection, we're able to build relationships and recruit for the study. Okay, getting into the first, so we're going to share with you some themes and sub-themes that came up in both of the studies. The first that I'll share with you is from our first study looking at pre and post-migration experiences, specifically trauma. All of the individuals on our study mentioned experience in violence. So our first theme here was violence inflicted upon the person. The violence came in forms of physical violence, sexual violence, verbal violence, and assaults. And this was largely a reaction to the disclosure of their sexual identity. In some countries, some participants have shared that people were seeking them out in order to inflict violence on them based just on their identity. For one example, there was a participant that shared that they would get on the dating apps, and people would pretend like they're there to meet, but later find out that they were actually cops going to try to out people and to find them, and through that inflicting violence on them. They also experienced non-affirming cultural messages. So the messages that they received back home included things like, in this country, we believe in honor killings. Homophobic family members and society have the right to sort of just take the law into their own hands. They received messages that invalidated their identity, and they were forced to hide that part of themselves. Others also spoke about the idea of being an infidel, being called an infidel back home. One participant shared, this is a quote, "Anyone can end your life, or any relative can end your life on that ground and not face any punishment on their crimes." And this is just because of a relative finding out about their sexual gender identity. They also received messages of hate. Another participant shared, "I should hate myself, and that I should hate the ones like me," speaking about being LGBTQ, "and that I was despicable and an evil person."
Once again, I'm muted. On the second study, when it came to the pre-migration trauma, we noticed some survival mechanisms that these folks had in order to get through the pre-migration trauma and make it to a new country. Part of it was navigating some negative messaging. They had to learn how to navigate that. And so in that process, they kind of used a survival mode and mindset. So they said that kind of this continued experience of fear instilled in them the survival mode. And we have kind of a quote to describe that, which is one participant said, "The constant fear of the consequences of being gay," i.e., all of the things that Dr. Attia described, right? The violence perpetrated upon them has made them develop kind of a thick skin. The other piece that they spoke about in the pre-migration is that they had some hope and ability to plan for escape. So they sometimes started with short trips where they could be themselves. And that, when we say that, is they were able to embrace their LGBTQ plus identity in these short trips, and therefore say, okay, there is a place in this world that I don't have to hide, and I won't be persecuted for who I am. That hope was an essential piece to surviving the pre-migration trauma. And it helped them navigate all of the violence that they experienced. They had hope that they could escape. Dr. T, I'll switch it.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Das. I want to mention, actually, as a disclaimer here, the participants we have in this study did have the privilege of being able to leave. So they either had the ability to go and pursue education in another country, or had the means financially to be able to travel. All of our participants were well educated. So they were not when you stereotypically think of refugee or asylum seeker, these are folks that don't necessarily fit within that box. They were lucky enough to get out, but unfortunately, that's not the case for many LGBTQ plus folks who are still in these regions. Okay, back to some pre and post migration experiences here. The complexity of the asylum process. So folks spoke about this being very traumatic. So the asylum process is not an easy one for folks to go through. The process is long. During that time, they don't have any healthcare access. They have financial barriers. It's very expensive to go through the process. They experience unemployment. So legally, they're not able to work in the US because they don't have a legal status. They experience extortion and experience homelessness at times as well. the experiences were also compounded by the uncertainties within the system. So many spoke about, you apply for asylum and you sort of just have to wait. You don't know how long you're waiting. You don't know if at any day they're going to come and deport you because you don't have, legal status, or you don't have asylum yet. You're still an asylum seeker. Slash, they are unaware if their asylum is going to be accepted or not. So it's a time of uncertainty for them, as well as experiencing some barriers towards adjustment. One being a lack of sociocultural capital, having some language barriers, and being in an area, depending geographically where they are, where the political discourse had impacts on them. For all participants, English was a second or third language, and they spoke about the inconsistencies in policies and administrations and how these have exacerbated the issues. So when we conducted the study, this was back during the Trump administration, and as we know, every administration has different rules as far as immigration and how many refugees we're allowing in and so forth. And so the political climate played a big role as well in their adjustment and their experiences post-migration.
Similarly, going back to the piece of post-migration, we did see that they had some kind of external resources that help them in their post-traumatic growth journeys and resiliency. So the first one was the support system. So this kind of goes back to what Dr. Attia mentioned about the lack of sociocultural capital. When they did have some capital, that support system and that sense of belonging was so critical. So primarily, they found those to be in LGBTQI plus friends, as well as what many of them described as chosen family. So we have our families of origin, where several of them did not feel that they belonged in those families, whereas now they were able to find some chosen families in these LGBTQI plus friendships, and other inclusive community organizations. I think it's important to note that these organizations existed exclusively outside of their home countries. So these were here usually when they found them, or in the process of coming here, they were able to find these supports. This kind of sharing helps people feel not as isolated during the process. They were able to say, okay, there is community like me. I think this speaks a lot to kind of when people were able to experience hope too, right? Is when they could take little vacations or some kind of respite away from their communities and fully identify in their LGBTQI identity. So similarly, they're finding that community in these places, and it's less isolating. The other piece, and this comes to the capital, is that they were able to find informative resources and services. And where did they find them? Social media. I think we need to really think about this. A lot of us are academics or in this ivory tower. We're like, okay, we're going to make sure our research goes to this journal, research goes to this journal. But social media is where a lot of people are accessing things. So if you're doing things for the people, social media might be a good place to publish little snippets to give people some idea of access. But social media, dating apps is where some people met other folks in the LGBTQIA plus community and then were able to join them at their community events. Books, and I think that holds a lot of implications for how we work with folks in this community, and movies. So books and movies both. The other piece is services that actually provided legal and mental health support. So again, it's better when they were no cost legal supports and high quality mental health care, but we know that comes far and few between for this community. But for those that were able to access it, and I can't remember, but I think one of them mentioned that they spent like about $12,000 in legal costs over their time, just trying to navigate the asylum process. And that person did have savings before they arrived to this country. So they were able to have that. So again, highlighting what Dr. Attia mentioned, not only did these folks have hope, but a lot of them did have some access to some resource that would help them navigate this. Yes. On.
The next two themes here are mental health distress and self-medicating behavior. So this is one aspect that had been documented in the literature, and our participants have echoed this, but participants spoke about experiencing PTSD, depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation from the experiences of traumas pre and post migration, as well as having some invasive and inescapable distress, mental health distress. When it came to self-medicating behaviors, our participants spoke about self-harm and substance abuse, particularly alcohol, as a way to navigate the mental health distress, as well as the context of religiosity and sexuality. So one participant specifically spoke about having some issues with substance use and being recommended to go to AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. And when they arrived, they didn't realize that that AA had a very strong spiritual / religious component. And for them, that was very triggering and very re-traumatizing, because one of the reasons that they experienced a lot of the hatred back home relating to their sexual and gender identity was from religious individuals and religion as a whole. And so referring folks to somewhere like AA to seek help where it was actually causing more trauma was not very helpful for them. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the implications specifically for counseling and providing resources for folks that would be more culturally responsive and appropriate for their experiences.
Yes. So similarly to these self-medicating behaviors that maybe are affecting them in every state, and it is included, but there are several coping strategies that they discussed in terms of adapting to what they've experienced. So one of them we kind of categorized as meaningful productivity, just in several different ways that folks talked about keeping busy. So whether that means that they were working or volunteering in ways that kind of kept them busy, or if they were engaging in their own creative expressions. Um, Several mentioned journaling, dancing, but also there's scholarship school. So we're talking about education of refugees in this workshop today. That kind of like busyness did provide some meaningful productivity that helped all of our asylum seeking participants cope. I also think, though, that the meaningful productivity piece did also veer on the way of the navigation of the asylum process and how crippling that could be. Sorry, crippling is not a good word. It's not very anti-oppressive, but it does stop them in so many places where they're like, I don't know what else to do. So the productivity gave them something where they saw progression, where maybe in the asylum process they were not. The other piece is self-empowerment and sharing narratives. This kind of comes with a little asterisk because it felt good for many of them to share stories, but they were very cautious about whom they were sharing stories with. So back to Dr. Attia's intentionality in making relationships with this community organization and being there. And these are 2 studies, at least with these folks. Building those relationships were so key to letting them speak in their voices and share their voices. One of our participants shared that they love to share, especially as a person who's been through a lot. So they've been going to a lot of events and speaking. They said somehow it makes me feel good too. But again, I just need to know how much I can share with people in order to protect myself. So there we go. A lot of our creative outlets, meaningful productivity, and then sharing their narratives. The last thing, sorry, Dr. Attia, this is you.
All right. So last theme here was isolation and fear. So we know from the literature that social connectedness is a strong protective factor for folks. And Dr. Doss spoke about how some folks were able to connect to community organizations and find support here. But many spoke about having this constant fear and having a feeling of isolation. Participants shared that they experienced being cut off from their family members back home. Um, the anxiety of being re-traumatized and having that fear of being denied asylum was an ever-present experience for them. And I also want to share that with this population, as compared to their counterparts who are not LGBTQ, these folks are typically coming here by themselves. They are not connected to their family. They're oftentimes ostracized from their families. And at this point, they are just sort of having to start from scratch. So isolation was a big theme here. One participant shared, "I'm so not looking forward to go to the Middle East to visit my family because they can lock me up, or they can prevent me from traveling back, or whatever is going to happen." So they have that fear even post asylum. If they're going to go back home, they still have that fear present of what's going to happen when I go back there, and they might just keep me there. The experiences of isolation since being cut off from families and not yet connecting to others in the United States, as I spoke a little earlier, is something that was also present for folks. One participant shared, "When I first came, I was isolated. I had left all my friends back home. I knew no friends here, and I was just always on my own. I was kind of worried about my mental status of being alone and having no one to talk to." As you can imagine, this is an experience for someone who's coming to a new country with not having a full grasp of the language, not knowing anyone, how challenging that could be. But the good news is there's post-traumatic growth and there's resilience, and I'll leave that to Dr. Dawes here.
Yes. So what we saw here when it comes to resilience is that it's pretty complex. So there's both an acceptance process that happened with an increased sense of self in that process. So they're accepting some things, but also developing that sense of self. So they all talked about how they took a process to understand who they are and embrace their LGBTQ plus identity. Whereas before they might have only had snippets of time that they could really explore what's going on. But here they started proceeding and understanding that in this process, they had to let go of a lot of self-hate. So Dr. Attia mentioned that first theme, how self-hate was so prevalent in that pre-migration experience. So they needed to let go of some of that and divorce themselves from those problems with identity and move towards radical acceptance of who they are and what they cannot control. So in that process, they forgave themselves for things that were not their fault. So, they talked about different things related to um, having to leave their families, or some people talked about in the asylum, in their migration process, um, places where they might have been let go from something or not been able to access something. They had to forgive themselves and say, "This was not my fault, and I radically accept who I am and give myself forgiveness too." The other piece here is that they talked about both innate characteristics that helped with resilience, but also things that they learned. So a lot of folks talked about something that we kind of qualified, because one person did use this word, doggedness. Um, they felt that they used the word doggedness a lot during that interview, I remember. But kind of this innate doggedness that they were not going to give up, they were going to persist. So they talked about it as almost like innate. It's an aspect of their character. They knew that they were going to keep going. And we talked about some reasons that might be, right? We talked about resources. We talked about the installation of hope, maybe pre-migration. However, post-migration, what they had to learn were patience, because the asylum process is long, it has many gaps of unknown, and then persistence. So persistence is that other piece that relates to doggedness. Maybe they came with that innate practice, but the actual act of persistence was something that they had to learn in their new environment. So this kind of leads to just the survival and resilience themes that we found in total. what we found is that their kind of journey showed a lot of um, growth pieces, survival pieces, resilience pieces. So they fled their home countries. They sought actively and accepted, again, right? That's the other piece, support. They reframed their traumas in a lot of ways as, okay, this is something I survived and this is something that I got through and moved away from. That's my past, not my present, right? And they talked about various ways of coping that I talked about, journaling, productivity, etc. They also expressed a lot of gratefulness about their new situations. And we're not saying here that like people should just be grateful for what they experience, but that attitude of gratefulness was something that they all expressed in terms of where they feel they are now. And the gratefulness was not necessarily towards, their rescuers. That's not what we're talking about. Gratefulness towards themselves, thanking themselves. So, but this person we took this quote is that they were grateful that they never had to sleep in the streets. I had to sleep in some very humble places that were not clean, a lot of canned food, a lot of mac and cheese, not very healthy. But at the end of the day, I was full. So I was grateful, very grateful. And they, when folks talk about these things, they had to seek out these experiences and accept that support. So in a lot of ways, they're thinking themselves. They found strength in understanding their need for help and seeking help. So they said, okay, it's okay to seek help, which we see as something that, once you seek help, you're able to actually talk through a lot of the things. So even mental health care is what we're talking about, despite any stigma that might exist. And then finally, they do have an awareness of their strength and resilience and how it contributed to their current existence. So again, thinking themselves, understanding that their doggedness, etc., was part of this process. So this holds some implications for the folks here as we all talk. So I know that that clinicians should be bolded too, but I know that as we kind of presented this workshop, not me, Dr. Wright, well, really thank you for setting up this workshop. We wanted to focus on the education of refugees. So here we have implications for educators, but we're counselors. And a lot of the folks on this call are counselors. We know our students that might be looking at the recording are counselors. So we want to talk about both. So the first aspect is trauma sensitivity. And this kind of goes to what we know in the counseling field and in a lot of the mental health and helping professions as trauma-informed care. So an awareness, as Dr. Attia mentioned, like an awareness of the pre-migration trauma, sure, but also what the migration process is like and the traumas that they might be experiencing at the time. So trauma-informed care will keep us aware of what is going on, give us more insight into why we need consistency in the work that we do, and we need to be there. And we need to, I think Dr. Cha's presentation about like listening to them and how important that is in trauma-informed care. This also includes education about the asylum process. So it's hard to be trauma-informed when people do not know what the traumas are. So as educators, let's educate. Let's talk to people about what the process is. And maybe if we don't know everything, we can bring in these voices that we had in the study or other voices, and also bring in those folks that might know more about the legal procedures, the financial procedures that are out of our scope of practice and competence to help with other people. So this kind of goes then with the collaboration with other stakeholders. Let's bring together these teams to help folks make the process a little bit more digestible. Because again, so many people talked about the support teams, support systems that they had. They're more likely to trust a support if it comes as a referral from another support that they already trusted. So if we can bring these together and keep these connections going, we can wrap around support instead of doing our lone work and trying to gain trust every time. Another piece is keeping things strength-based. So for educators, that's understanding that there is a survival mindset and a resourcefulness that folks bring. And same for clinicians, understanding that those are strengths. But that means that we don't have to say, okay, you didn't necessarily grasp this concept. We're done, let's move on. We can provide them resources and help them identify their own resources to further educate themselves. Like, they have made it through so much. Our class is not going to be a barrier for them. We can help them figure things out and succeed. The next piece is integration of books and media. I thought this was just so valuable from what we learned in our study. The amount of folks that talked about seeing LGBTQ voices, and especially LGBTQ voices that met at different intersections of identity, especially race, ethnic, and linguistic diversity, really were valuable for them. So the more that educators can integrate those articles, books, voices, videos, documentaries into their coursework, the more valuable it's going to be. And similar for counselors, integrate some bibliotherapy, have creative approaches to what they can maybe do for homework at home, and then talk about that in your practice. And then finally, the piece is from the narrative sharing that they talked about. So educators, I think Dr. Cha focused on this in their presentation, but the idea of narratives sharing is so powerful. It's a way that they can practice too, right? We talked about English as a second or third language for a lot of folks. And a lot of folks did kind of narrative sharings in English with their interviews or other things that they did, but some people integrated both their home languages and English in various productions and performances. So that's also there too. For clinical work, there are narrative approaches to trauma treatment. So cognitive processing therapy is one of those, narrative therapy, trauma-focused, cognitive behavioral therapy. These are all focuses. These are all treatments that focus on that narrative and give folks an opportunity to share their narrative and then reconstruct their narrative. So I think those are all great implications. And then I'm going to talk through the stakeholders that are not necessarily educators or clinicians, because I don't know where this recording is being disseminated, and I think that anybody could find value from the work that these folks have put into talking to us. So one thing is our politicians and our people in the world that have money and power. Let's fund some research into coordinated care and support. How can we fund these organizations, get more research into those organizations, but also give more resources to these organizations so they can continue to do the work? Next piece is creatives, which I think that's fun because we don't really get to talk about implications for creatives very often in our fields. Maybe museum education does, but have some more showcases for the asylee and refugee narratives, folks that are feeling brave enough to go into those spaces and feeling supported enough. How can we create these places that they can share their narratives and be heard and listened to? Going back to Dr. Cha's presentation as well. We also think that this is a good call for publication of more of those asylee and refugee stories. If we're bringing them into the education spaces and those clinical spaces, we need the resources to exist. So this is a call for more of those resources to exist. Community organizers, that should say find community resources. So there's kind of a lot of the folks talked about how important it was to find like social media, but also connect the resources and know who to go to. So we're calling for more online and on-ground resources to be found to serve the asylum seekers and refugees, but specifically looking at intersectional experiences, because it is diverse, right? Somebody coming in with an intersectional identity where they might also, they might identify as LGBTQIA+, but they might also have disabilities that they're also navigating. Those intersectional experiences important to highlight in the media that we have so that people do feel seen and heard. And then finally, researchers, because that's where a lot of us are on this call, bringing community care and voice into the research process. So Dr. Attia has done, again, like a really, really amazing job connecting with these folks. But I think it's important that our research also advocates for these voices. So it's not that we're going in and coming back out, but phenomenology allows us to sit there and really understand the essence of the experience. Narrative inquiry We take their stories and then try to find maybe those narrative commonalities and understand the story as a whole. And then community-based participatory action research. This can be very, very helpful in communities that experience intersectional marginalization, especially. And I think we can move more into that. I know that it takes a lot of time and effort, but we do think those implications are important. So finally, we leave some time for questions. I know Dr. Wright put something in the chat to drop your questions. Please feel free, but also feel free to hop in, raise your hand, whatever you need.
Thank you, Dr. Das. If I could just add one thing really quickly about the last implication slide. I want folks to be aware that, so for the implication that Dr. Das shared here about policies and grants that fund research, the infrastructure for refugee resettlement agencies is very different than for agencies that help asylum seekers. So the refugee resettlement agency process is more robust, right? Resettlement agencies for refugees are working within a system. It has a process that's more outlined, and they do have more funding and they have more resources. On the other hand, organizations that work with asylum seekers don't have that infrastructure at all. They're having to go out and to hunt for these resources, and sort of just figure out where they're able to get money and how to make their organization survive. So there's a big distinction there, and there's a very strong need for advocating for policies as well as funding to help with specifically asylum seekers and the agencies that support these individuals. All right, happy to take questions with anyone.
Thank you both for what was a wonderful presentation, for sharing your work. I will also let the audience know that both the articles that this project produced so far are in the chat, and I encourage you to actually read the work, take the articles, actually search these researchers, give them the citations and the reads that they deserve, because this cannot be anything like easy work. And the fact that you've produced 2 articles from it should be admired and should be read. And I'm sure you're giving it to your students, but for those that aren't in the pleasure of in counseling, you can read this work and benefit from it yourself.